On November 13th, 2022, four University of Idaho students were brutally killed in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. Within weeks, the case exploded online. TikToks, Reddit threads, armchair detectives, and endless speculation. But beneath all that noise sits one core document, the publicly released Probable Cause Affidavit, or PCA. That affidavit is the official roadmap investigators presented to a judge to justify the arrest of the suspect, Bryan Kohberger. It's dry, technical, and very different from the dramatic narratives you see on social media. Yet it quietly answers some of the biggest questions about this case and leaves others hanging. In this video, we're stripping away rumors and focusing only on what the PCA actually says. No embellishing, no fan fiction, just the words in the document and what they mean. By the end, you'll understand how investigators say they connected a white Elantra, a knife sheath, and one surviving roommate's memory into probable cause for arrest. Before we dive into the details, a quick roadmap. First, I'll explain what a probable cause affidavit actually is and what it's legally required to show. Then we'll walk, step by step, through the key sections. The layout of the house, eyewitness accounts from a surviving roommate, cell phone and vehicle data, DNA evidence on the knife sheath, and how all those strands are woven together. This isn't about arguing guilt or innocence, it's about understanding what investigators claim happened and how they say they know. Everyone is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in court. If you're into careful document-based breakdowns like this, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss future deep dives. And if you can, stick with me until the end. We'll finish by pulling out the biggest takeaways and where the affidavit leaves room for unanswered questions that could matter at trial. Let's start with the basics. What is a probable cause affidavit? In criminal cases, officers can't just arrest someone because they have a hunch. They have to convince a judge that there's probable cause, a reasonable belief based on facts that a specific person committed a specific crime. The PCA is the sworn statement, usually from a lead investigator, laying out those facts. It's not a full trial, it's not every piece of evidence, it's a curated narrative designed to show just enough to clear that legal threshold. In the Idaho case, the affidavit was written by Corporal Brett Payne of the Moscow Police Department. It summarizes the crime scene, witness interviews, surveillance video, phone records, vehicle data, and DNA analysis that, according to Payne, support the arrest of Bryan Kohberger. Remember, the PCA is one-sided by design. Defense evidence, alternative explanations, and cross-examination come later in court, not in this document. The PCA begins by setting the scene, a three-story off-campus house on King Road in Moscow, Idaho. Understanding the layout is crucial because the narrative of who was where and when depends on those floors and rooms. The house had multiple bedrooms and was known as a kind of social hub. According to the affidavit, two surviving roommates were sleeping on the first and second floors. The four victims, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were on the upper levels. The document notes that responding officers found the victims on the second and third floors with no signs of forced entry, and that a sheath for a Kabar-style knife was located near one of the victims. This layout matters. It frames the later description of a masked male seen inside, the path investigators believe the attacker took, and why certain people may or may not have heard or seen specific things that night. One of the most discussed parts of the PCA is the account from a surviving roommate identified by initials. According to the affidavit, she reported hearing noises in the early morning hours and thought she heard one victim say something like, "There's someone here." She also told investigators she later heard what sounded like crying from another bedroom and a male voice saying something along the lines of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." The PCA emphasizes that these are approximations, not exact quotes. Critically, the affidavit says she opened her bedroom door multiple times. On the final time, she reported seeing a figure described as a male, approximately 5'10" or taller, athletic but not muscular build, with bushy eyebrows, dressed in black with a mask covering his nose and mouth, walking toward the sliding glass door. This description, especially the bushy eyebrows detail, becomes important later when the PCA connects it to the identified suspect. The roommate's account raises a major public question. Why wasn't 911 called immediately? The PCA doesn't directly answer that, and that absence has fueled intense speculation online. What the affidavit does say is this. Based on her statement, she was in a frozen shock phase, and she locked herself in her room after seeing the masked figure. It notes that a 911 call wasn't placed until later that day, using a surviving roommate's phone to report an unconscious person. Legally, the PCA's job isn't to explain emotional reactions, it's to connect facts that establish probable cause. Trauma responses can be complex and counterintuitive. Freezing is recognized in psychological literature. The important takeaway from the affidavit itself is narrower. Investigators accept that she saw someone, they document her description, and they use that observation, along with other evidence, as one of several pillars supporting their theory of who was inside the house that night. The PCA next builds a timeline using digital breadcrumbs, phone records, surveillance cameras, and movement data. Investigators focus heavily on a white Hyundai Elantra seen in the area of the King Road house. According to the affidavit, cameras from around Moscow and the nearby university captured a white sedan making multiple passes by the residents in the early morning hours, then leaving the neighborhood at a high rate of speed shortly after the estimated time of the murders. Detectives used these videos to identify the vehicle type and approximate model year. That information was then shared with law enforcement databases and colleges, which, the PCA says, eventually led them to a white Hyundai Elantra registered to Bryan Kohberger. The affidavit describes how they linked that car's movements, both in Washington state and around the crime scene area, to dates before and after the murders, suggesting what they interpret as surveillance or familiarity with the neighborhood. Beyond video, the PCA leans heavily on cell phone data. Investigators obtained records for a phone number associated with Bryan Kohberger. They examined where that phone connected to cellular towers on specific dates and times. According to the affidavit, the phone was in the general area of the King Road residence on multiple occasions in the months before the crime, what investigators interpret as possible pre-incident surveillance. Importantly, during the key window, when the murders are believed to have occurred, the PCA says the phone appears to have been turned off or otherwise not connecting to the network. After that window, the phone reappears on the network, with records showing movements consistent with returning to the Pullman, Washington area where Kohberger lived. Location data from cell towers isn't pinpoint GPS, and the PCA doesn't claim exact addresses from this alone. Instead, it uses tower-based ranges to argue patterns of presence and absence that, combined with other evidence, support probable cause. One of the most critical pieces of physical evidence in the PCA is the knife sheath. The affidavit states that officers found a tan leather sheath marked K-bar lying on the bed next to one of the victims. Crime lab testing, according to the document, revealed a single source of male DNA on the snap button of that sheath. That profile did not initially match anyone in CODIS, the federal DNA database. Investigators then turned to what's often called investigative genetic genealogy, or familial DNA techniques. The PCA explains that authorities obtained trash from the home of Kohberger's family in Pennsylvania. A DNA sample from that trash is alleged to be consistent with being the biological father of the person whose DNA was on the sheath. From there, they say, the statistical probability that the DNA on the sheath belonged to someone other than a child of that man is extremely low, forming a major part of the probable cause argument. Vehicle and phone data tied a person to the area. DNA on the sheath connected that person's alleged biological line to the crime scene. The PCA then bridges the gap with direct identification, linking those clues to Bryan Kohberger. According to the affidavit, law enforcement confirmed that Kohberger owned a white Hyundai Elantra, matching the one seen on surveillance. They also obtained his driver's license records, which listed physical characteristics, height, weight, and notably photographs. The PCA points out that his license photo shows features consistent with the surviving roommate's description of the intruder, approximately the same height range, build, and bushy eyebrows. This is not presented as a perfect match, but as one more converging detail. Officers also surveilled him in person before the arrest, comparing his appearance, vehicle, and known movements to the patterns established in the digital evidence, further reinforcing their probable cause theory. The PCA also describes the crime scene in methodical clinical terms: blood, patterns of injury, and where each victim was found. It doesn't sensationalize, it documents. Crucially, it notes the absence of certain things as well. There were no signs of forced entry. The house had a keypad lock on the front door and a sliding glass door in the back. The affidavit doesn't say definitively how the suspect entered, but the lack of damage suggests either an unlocked entrance or prior familiarity. The document also references a latent shoe print outside one surviving roommate's bedroom door, described as having a diamond pattern. Investigators believe it was left by the intruder. While the PCA doesn't tie this print to a specific shoe brand or person at this stage, it's another physical point that places an unknown individual moving through the house along the route the roommate described. Putting the pieces together, the PCA reads like a puzzle being assembled. A white Elantra circling the neighborhood at relevant times. Phone records showing a device linked to Kohberger repeatedly near the house in the months before, then going dark during the critical window. A surviving roommate's observation of a masked man matching his general build and eyebrow description. DNA on a knife sheath, allegedly linked through the suspect's father's sample. Each element alone might be explainable. Together, the affidavit argues, they establish probable cause that Bryan Kohberger was the person inside the house during the murders. But remember, probable cause is a lower standard than beyond a reasonable doubt. The PCA doesn't have to close every gap or predict every defense challenge. Its job is to justify an arrest and initial charges, not to serve as the state's final, complete trial narrative. Just as important as what's in the PCA is what isn't. The affidavit doesn't detail motive. It doesn't explain why these specific victims or whether there was any prior personal contact. It doesn't answer every inconsistency people online point out, like noise levels, exact timelines inside the house, or the suspect's behavior in the days right after. That's by design. Prosecutors rarely show all their cards in a probable cause filing, especially in a high-profile case. Other lab results, digital forensics, interview transcripts, and expert analyses may exist, but remain undisclosed or under seal. The defense, in turn, will attack many of the PCA's building blocks: reliability of cell tower data, potential contamination or interpretation of DNA, eyewitness memory under stress, and whether alternative suspects or scenarios were fully excluded. The affidavit is a snapshot of the state's theory at one moment in time, not the final word on the evidence. Let's distill the key takeaways from what the Idaho Probable Cause Affidavit actually says. First, it portrays the investigation as evidence layered: house layout and witness accounts, vehicle surveillance, phone location data, and DNA on a knife sheath all feeding into one suspect. Second, it emphasizes patterns: repeated phone presence near the house before the crime, a phone going dark during the murders, and a car making multiple passes at odd hours. Third, the PCA treats the surviving roommate's description, especially the bushy eyebrows, as a corroborating detail, not the sole basis for identification. Fourth, it leans heavily on the genetic link between DNA on the sheath and a sample from Kohberger's father. Finally, the document is selective by nature. It's strong enough in the judge's view to justify an arrest, but it leaves critical questions: motive, alternative explanations, potential weaknesses for the adversarial process of trial to explore. If you've made it this far, you now understand the Idaho student murders PCA far beyond the headlines and speculation. You've seen how a probable cause affidavit isn't a conspiracy manifesto or a full trial script. It's a legally targeted argument built from selected facts to justify an arrest. As this case moves through the courts, more information will surface: motions challenging the DNA, experts debating cell data, and perhaps additional evidence the public hasn't seen yet. Whatever happens, separating what's actually in the documents from what's imagined online will stay crucial. If you value slow, document-focused breakdowns like this, where we read what's really there and not just what goes viral, consider subscribing, hitting the notification bell, and sharing this video with someone who's been following the case. Drop your thoughts or questions about the PCA in the comments. I read them and they help shape future deep dives into major cases like this.